The Virtual Boy was a pretty bad console, but could Sega's own 32-bit console be worse? The 32X was Sega's answer to the Atari Jaguar, and many people feel that it was one of the worst consoles of all time, even worse than the Virtual Boy. Recently, I did a video discussing the Virtual Boy and why many people thought it was a terrible game console. I looked at many of its games and came to the conclusion that people just base their opinions on the terrible games. The 32X has an extensively bigger library than the Virtual Boy. But why was it considered worse? And does it truly deserve all the hate it receives? I'll be looking at many of the games, including the 4 launch games. Let's begin with a look at the system itself. Once again, just like my Virtual Boy, my 32X, Genesis were both melted in the same accident. So please bear with me on the pictures. Firstly, let's address the issues that are most popular. The 32X was originally conceived as a standalone console, codenamed the Neptune. There is even a prototype of the Neptune, which, mind you, looks much better than the 32X does. It's not even funny how ugly the 32X looks in comparison with the Neptune. But yes, you heard me correctly. The 32X was originally a standalone console, which means it isn't technically a console, or rather its own console. But see, that's the worst part. It requires its own separate power source, a cable to connect it with the Sega Genesis, and metal prongs for the Model 1. So does that make it a console or an add-on? Well, it still required the Genesis Model 1 or 2 to use, so yeah, definitely not its own console. There were so many cables, you would have less with an early 90s PC. The 32X had a pretty terrible library, and it cost a lot for the console, add-on, though Sega stated that it was a low-cost way to get into the 32X market. Now that we've covered the top reasons that many people consider the 32X a terrible console or add-on, let's talk about how this came to be. This was all due to one big mistake. In the Winter Consumer Electronics Show of 1994, Sega brainstormed the idea to compete against Atari by upgrading the Genesis's color palette. Project Jupiter was the code name, and it would feature not only a better color palette, but a lower cost than the upcoming Saturn, as well as with some limited 3D capabilities thanks to the integration of ideas from the development of the Sega Virtua processor chip. This idea was scrapped due to an executive named Joe Miller, who stated, quote, "Oh, that's a horrible idea," in response to releasing an upgraded version of the Genesis. The decision to create a new system was made by Nakayama and broadly supported by Sega of America employees, namely Joe Miller. At the suggestion of Sega of America's executive Joe Miller and his team, the console was converted into an add-on to the existing Genesis to make it more powerful. Conceived as Project Mars, the 32X was created to bridge the gap between the Sega CD and the Sega Genesis to the Saturn, and was to compete with the Atari Jaguar as well. Sega was afraid that the Saturn wasn't going to release by the end of 1994, so they decided to release this in November 1994. Sega designed the 32X as a peripheral for the existing Genesis, expanding its power with 2 32-bit SH2 processors and a 3D graphics processor. Some that worked at Sega claimed that the system was so rushed, it was created on a cocktail napkin at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1994. And surprise, surprise, it was rushed to market along with the games too. This not only caused problems, but the fact that it was an attachment and not a very aesthetically pleasing one at that, caused people to just wait for the Saturn. And those who may have bought it that didn't have a console would have to shell out $160 along with the price of a new Genesis. That's right, the attachment itself cost $160 by itself, and no wonder people were more than a bit put off. Sega claimed this was a transitional console and was to be a less expensive alternative to the Saturn, but it just made Sega look greedy and dumb to the consumers, according to some Sega executives at the time. This was due to the fact that in Japan, the Saturn's release coincided the 32X's release in North America. In the Summer Consumer Electronics Show, founder of the 3DO company, Trip Hawkins, stated, "Everyone knows the 32X is a band-aid. It's not a next generation system. It's fairly expensive. It's not particularly high performance. It's hard to program for, and it's not compatible with the Saturn." I find this incredibly ironic, considering the 3DO was almost just as bad. Before its release, Sega was hyping this attachment. Sega ran aggressive ad campaigns that just seemed ridiculous. The ads were usually edgy, loud, and in your face with the typical extreme fashion. Looking back on these ads, I can't help but laugh. Sega also stated that there were to be 12 launch games, and also 50 games would be available at the end of 1995, but only 4 launch games came, and the games were priced around $60 to $70 new. The launch games included Doom, Star Wars Arcade, Virtua Racing Deluxe, and Cosmic Carnage. Not the worst launch lineup, but clearly not 12 games. Speaking of games, due to its rush to market, third-party devs didn't have the time to fully utilize whatever the hardware was capable of, and it ended up about 40 games, some of which were ports of Genesis titles that looked slightly better. Believe it or not, there wasn't even an official Sonic game released for the 32X, just Knuckles Chaotix, which isn't Sonic. That'd be like Nintendo making a console without a proper Mario game for it. Oh, never mind. Another reason devs weren't making games for this system was the looming release of the Saturn. Why develop games for a system that might only be around for a year at best? Way to shoot yourself in the foot there, Sega. But without seeing the games, there would be no way to really know if this system was as terrible as everyone claims. So enough of the history lesson. Let's see if the Genesis does what Nintendo don't. There was no pack-in game with the 32X's, but with the Mega Drive version, Motocross was supposedly packed in with it. So, Motocross is a basic dirt bike racing game, and the first thing you'll notice is that it follows the 90s extreme trend. The graphics are pretty bad, though colorful. It feels a lot like the backgrounds were made in MS Paint with clip art, at least for the menus. And for whatever reason, my cart had the name JCAAAAAAAA on it. The gameplay isn't impressive either, but at the beginning of every race, all the racers jumble up together like idiots, and it always feels like you're slipping on the track. A lot of the time, you will also hit bumps that will stop you dead in your tracks as well. This game takes a page from Road Rash and allows for hitting of other characters, but it's pretty sloppy. All in all, probably one of the worst racing games I've ever played. It definitely doesn't look that good either. Cosmic Carnage is a launch game that copied Mortal Kombat's gore along with its fighting style. One of the things that separates this though is that you can use heavy or light armor in your fights, and you and your opponent can break the armor off. I really can't tell why this is on 32X. Some of the backgrounds are interesting and feature moving images, but it's still really distracting. I played this for a bit, but I found it hard to figure out combos, and it wasn't as fun as fighting games like Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, or Soul Calibur. Star Wars Arcade was another launch game for the 32X, and this one emulated the Star Wars arcade cabinet. It did a pretty good job. It even had some really great digitized voices and scenes from the movie. The gameplay actually feels like 3D Star Wars game, flying around and blasting TIE fighters and destroying the Empire. The game even sets you in a first-person viewpoint as you fly your X-Wing. Other than that, the game getting a bit tedious. Yeah, this is probably one of the best arcade ports on the system. Virtua Racing was the third launch title for the 32X, and a really great racing game. You're given several modes to play, and the choice of 3 cars: stock, formula, and prototype. This game is a really well-made racer. Using polygon graphics makes it really innovative for the time. but the draw distance is pretty short and sometimes it's hard to see what's coming up ahead. It's also a bit hard to control, but other than that, a great racing game for sure. It even gives you the option for several viewpoints, and the final launch game was Doom. And while Doom was available on the SNES, it was released for the 32X instead of the Genesis. The game looks pretty pixelated, and right off the bat there are alterations to the game that make it fit on 32X cartridge. Some of the levels are missing things that you'd be used to having, and the controls are pretty bad too. To make it easier on the 32X, there is a border added to make the screen smaller. Not the best version of Doom. Many DOS PCs at the time could do much better. Blackthorn was also ported to the 32X, and while being upgraded in the graphics department, is almost the same as the SNES version. The only thing different is the sidebar, showing you at all times the items on hand. Other than that, it's almost identical. Not a bad game, but why was it on the 32X? BC Racing is a prehistoric game that has Chuck Rock in it. This is a pretty difficult racing game for two reasons. One, your bike can be destroyed, and two, if you hit anything, you not only take damage, but you get knocked back as well. You can never catch up to the other races once this happens. It's nice looking, but too hard to be fun, for me at least. The controls felt slippery, and I always felt like my bike was gonna end up destroyed. Darkside is a first-person take on Asteroids. The gameplay speaks for itself. You ever wanted to play Asteroids in first-person mode? No? Then don't play this game. Calibre was an interesting game. Designed by the same people as Echo the Dolphin, is basically a side-scrolling shooter. Your job is to remove all the insects from the flowers so the hummingbirds can get to them. You can get several power-ups, but most of them are pretty bad. I ended up sticking with the homing laser. As soon as you lose the homing laser though, it's pretty difficult to make it through the game. It's not a bad game though, and you should try it out if you can. Metalhead was a mech warrior kind of game. It required the player to sit behind a mech in a first-person viewpoint. The digitized actors were pretty scary to watch when they spoke. The gameplay is pretty basic. Missions required elimination of enemy mechs. It's pretty bland, and the draw distance was pretty bad as well. MechWarrior is a much better game. Avoid Metalhead. Afterburner is probably the reason anyone would buy the 32X. It's almost a perfect port from the arcade. It's fast, it's in your face, and it's fun jet dogfighting action. The game sits you behind an on-rail shooter that requires you to shoot down a specific amount of enemies for each section of the game. You're given a limited number of missiles and rearmed every few levels. Primal Rage is another great arcade port for the 32X. While it was available on the SNES, it definitely looks and plays much better on the 32X. It's almost an identical port. I really enjoy this fighting game a lot, and it really makes the system worth playing. Virtua Fighter was another fighting game ported to the 32X. It's definitely aged quite a bit and used polygon graphics to animate its fighters. The fighters feel like they are jumping on the moon, and it just felt really unnatural to play. Because it was one of the first 3D fighters, even though it was a close arcade port, it isn't really that fun anymore. I would suggest the more updated versions of the game. And finally, Knuckles Chaotix. This game was supposed to be the Sonic game for the 32X. I have heard that Sega removed Sonic and Tails from this game because they felt that it may have been a flop and didn't want to destroy Sonic's image. Digging deeper into this, a game called Sonic Crackers was originally being developed for the 32X and featured Sonic and Tails holding the same rings as Knuckles Chaotix. The game itself isn't anything special. The only new feature is that it requires the game to be played with two characters tethered together with a ring chain. You must use the character's speed and momentum to throw or swing them higher or lower. If you think this mechanic sounds stupid or annoying, it is. Or at least it was for me. But hey, take a shot at it. Maybe it could be fun for you. I also played the Spider-Man Web of Fire and Brutal Above the Claw, though I'll spare you. They are probably the worst games on the system. There were several other games I did not mention, but I didn't want this video to go on forever. And there were also Sega CD 32X games that used both the Sega CD and 32X, but again, time's running out. But there you have it, the grand library of the 32X. So is the 32X as terrible as everyone makes it out to be? Yes. God, yes. This is a terrible console and a terrible idea. It only has a few games worth playing, and only only a handful that were perfect arcade ports. Where is Simpsons? Where is X-Men Arcade? Where is Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle? Instead, we got terrible version of Doom, awkward polygon fighting games, terrible blood and gore-filled Mortal Kombat wannabes, and the same obsolete racing games. Imagine paying $300 for a Genesis, a 32X, and $70 for a first-person Asteroids game. Sega even tried to make this system somewhat appealing by making many price reductions in 1995, but ultimately failed due to its consistent release of the add-ons and systems. The 32X played a big role in creating distrust in the market from its consumers, which in turn put another nail in Sega's coffin. Though the 32X was perceived as a commercial failure, it was still able to sell 660,000 units before being officially discontinued in 1996. And I want to remind you that even though this is a terrible system, it still has its appeal. Afterburner, Star Wars Arcade, Primal Rage, Calibre, they have some appeal and are fun. So my question to you, do you think the 32X was terrible, or do you think the games have redeeming qualities? Try it out for yourself if you can. Don't go searching to buy one. It really isn't worth it. But if you have the chance to try some of the games, see for yourself. Let me know in the comment section below if you think the 32X and its games were good or not. I've been your host, Protomario, and I'm signing out. Please like and share my work with others so they don't have to suffer the 32X by accident. Please note that in all my videos, if I use images from Google, that I do not own any of those images, and all images obtained from Google are owned by their respective owners and copyrights.